The air smelled of dust, oil, and dying light. In a forgotten corridor of the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, an old man stood before a mirror, not to gaze at himself but to paint, slowly, obsessively, as if he were chasing something inside the reflection. Something, or someone. His name was Diego Velázquez, and for 50 years he had painted kings and jesters, saints and sinners, but never himself. Not truly. Not until now. The mirror was cracked. Just like his memory. A stroke. A breath. Pause. His final painting would not be for glory. It would be a confession. A confession veiled in color, shadow, and silence. The silence of Seville. Diego Rodriguez de Silva y Velázquez was born in Seville, 1599, a city that bled both gold and suffering. His father, a noble of Portuguese descent, clung to a past of honor lost. His mother whispered prayers behind doors, as the Inquisition dragged men from their homes at midnight. The streets were filled with beggars and corpses, incense and rot. Diego watched. And he remembered everything. He never cried as a child. Not even when his younger brother drowned in the Guadalquivir River. Not even when hunger clawed at his stomach. Instead he sketched the shadows of grief, the folds of rags, the hollow stare of a dying mule. His gift was not beauty. It was truth. And truth, even in childhood, was dangerous. At 11 he was taken to study under Francisco Pacheco, a painter, scholar, and quiet enforcer of moral doctrine. Pacheco painted saints with clean hands and pure faces. Velázquez painted saints with cracked fingernails, eyes that doubted God. Pacheco should have dismissed him. Instead, he married him to his daughter Juana. Not out of love, but because even then, Pacheco saw something monstrous and divine inside the boy's brush. Faces no one saw. By 20, Diego Velázquez had become known in Seville not for beauty, but for brutal honesty. He painted peasants eating onions, black men with scarred hands, drunken philosophers laughing at death. In a Spain obsessed with divine order and monarchy, Velázquez painted the unseen, the inconvenient, the flesh. His paintings were alive. They breathed. They judged you. But one man saw beyond the controversy. Gaspar de Guzman, Count Duke of Olivares, the king's shadow and the most powerful man in Spain. "I need someone," Olivares whispered, "who can paint not the face of power, but its soul." Velázquez was summoned to Madrid in 1623. Within months he painted King Philip IV. But not as a god. As a man. Pale, tired, distant. It was the first royal portrait to cause scandal, and the first to never be taken down. Even Philip, cold and cautious, was haunted by it. Velázquez had found his prison, the royal court. Eyes behind the crown. Madrid was not a city. It was a theater. And the court, a masquerade of ambition, whispers, and slow decay. Velázquez watched it all. Quietly. He painted the queen, dead behind the eyes. The infanta, surrounded by dwarfs, trapped in velvet and silence. The jesters, painted with more dignity than kings. And the kings, always older than their years, aging behind smiles. He did not mock them. He didn't need to. His brush told the truth they feared. But it was his servant Juan de Pareja, a Moor, a slave, who became his silent mirror. In a time when blackness was hidden or erased, Velázquez painted Pareja as an equal. Not with pity. With power. The portrait shook Rome. It whispered, "See him. See us." Yet Velázquez never freed him until years later. Why? Because truth, even when painted, was never simple. Rome and the ghost of perfection. In 1649, Velázquez returned to Rome. Not to escape, but to chase something deeper. He had become obsessed. With form. With time. With perfection. He studied statues, ruins, the dying. He watched how skin turned blue in death. How light moved across marble. How God seemed absent even in the Sistine Chapel. He began to paint less. But what he painted was eternal. One work consumed him, the Rokeby Venus. A nude woman turned away, staring into a mirror held by Cupid. But her reflection? Cold. Blurred. Almost accusing. Was she love? Sin? Memory? Or was she Velázquez's own ghost staring back? When the painting was unveiled, they said it was obscene. Unchristian. But they still stared. Las Meninas, the trap of time. His final masterpiece was not painted for gold nor fame. It was painted for God. Or perhaps for death. Las Meninas. A princess. Maids. Dwarfs. A mastiff. A dying light. And in the center, Velázquez himself staring out at us. Behind them, a canvas. A door. A reflection of the king and queen. But the true subject? The viewer. The watched. The voyeur. It was not a painting. It was a trap. A mirror that asked, who is real? Who is the ghost? Was Velázquez painting the royals? Or was he painting you watching? Centuries later, no one knows. The blood beneath the brush. In 1660, Velázquez collapsed after organizing the royal wedding in France. He died quietly, surrounded by servants and silence. Some say his last words were, "Erase me." But the canvas could not. His paintings were left behind like open wounds. No halos. No heaven. Just truth. Raw. Beautiful. Unforgiving. The whispering walls of Seville. The first time he saw blood, he didn't scream. He stood quietly, a boy of barely 5, his dark eyes fixed on the crumpled body of a thief beaten to death in the plaza of Seville. People shouted, guards dragged the corpse, and women wept from balconies above. But Diego watched. Not with horror, but with a fascination so deep it rooted him to the stones beneath his feet. He saw not the violence, but the angles of the limbs, the twisted wrist, the bruises like paint on pale flesh. A picture began to form in his mind. One he would carry for decades. Even then he understood something others didn't. Truth, however ugly, was sacred. Diego Rodriguez de Silva y Velázquez was born in 1599 in a Spain cloaked in shadows. The Inquisition whispered behind every closed door. Heretics burned. Painters were craftsmen, not poets. And the church, bloated with power, dictated beauty like scripture. But the boy from Seville was different. Even as a child he rebelled, not loudly, but with a quiet defiance that poured from his brush. While others painted saints in gold halos, he sketched beggars in the dust. He saw holiness in hunger, in the weathered face of a street vendor, in the cracked hands of a fisherman holding a dead mackerel. He was the eldest of 8, the son of a modest nobleman and a deeply pious mother. Their home was tight with discipline, prayers, and the smell of olive oil. But Diego's world stretched further, through the back alleys of the city, to the markets where shadows clung to every corner. At 10 he was apprenticed to Francisco Pacheco, a painter known more for his theory than his brilliance. It was a strict, intellectual household. Diego absorbed every lesson like flame absorbs air. He studied anatomy, proportion, philosophy. But what gripped him most was light, how it struck a face at dawn, how it disappeared into fabric, how it turned sweat into silver on a laborer's brow. He painted obsessively. Not for praise. Not even for purpose. But because he could not paint. His fingers itched with it, his dreams swam in color, and silence drove him mad unless it was filled with the scratch of charcoal or the soft breath of oil on canvas. One night, he stole into the kitchen to paint the servant girl asleep by the hearth. The way the fire curled around her, the soot on her apron, her bare feet curled like the petals of a crushed flower, it was perfection. He was only 12, but that portrait, it held something strange. Something dangerous. Pacheco found it the next morning. He stared at it for a long time and said only one thing. "You see too much." Diego said nothing. He had already begun another. Part 2, The Court of Masks. By the time Diego Velázquez was 18, Seville could no longer hold him. His portraits, raw, unflinching, and startlingly alive, began to stir whispers across Andalusia. He painted not as others did, not in idealized beauty or soft flattery, but in truth. His subjects looked out from the canvas with weary eyes, crooked teeth, stained collars. And yet, they breathed. They lived. He married Pacheco's daughter, Juana, a quiet, devout woman who understood Diego's storms and never tried to calm them. They had children, though death would come for many of them before their names could even settle into memory. But Diego's mind was already drifting toward Madrid, toward the court, toward power, and toward the one man whose face would haunt his brush for the rest of his life. Philip IV. Spain's king was young, elegant, and drowning in the weight of a dying empire. The gold from the Americas was bleeding dry. The wars were endless. The church's grip was iron. And beneath the lace and incense, rot. Philip needed more than a painter. He needed someone who could make him immortal. When Diego arrived at court in 1623, the palace corridors were thick with perfume and secrets. Men in crimson silks plotted beneath tapestries. Eunuchs gossiped behind fans. Everyone wore masks, not literal ones but the kind carved into smiles too perfect, glances too measured, silence too long. Diego hated it. But he understood it. He was given a studio inside the Alcazar Palace, a place of cold grandeur where marble floors echoed like tombs. His task, paint the king. It was no ordinary commission. Philip IV was known to loathe painters. He dismissed dozens. But something in Velázquez's work had disturbed him, in a way he couldn't look away from. The first sitting was silent. Philip sat motionless in a high-backed chair, his fingers resting on the hilt of his sword, his eyes fixed on the wall behind Diego's head. But Diego didn't flinch. He studied the king the way a surgeon studies an open wound, the tired corners of his eyes, the faint tremble in his left hand, the way his jaw set tighter whenever the courtiers whispered just outside. For hours neither man spoke. Then Philip stood and left. No praise. No command. The next morning the court announced that Velázquez was to become the official court painter. What followed were years of masks and mirrors. Diego painted the royal family, the dwarfs, the jesters, the hounds, the rustling gowns of bored queens. His brush moved like a whisper through the decay of monarchy. Every painting was a confession, not his but theirs. He painted their fragility, their pride, their emptiness. And yet he was trusted. More than that, he became a confidant. He never spoke what he saw. Never betrayed what was whispered behind velvet curtains. But he recorded everything with his eyes. With his silence. They called him the painter of truth, though few understood how much it cost him. He missed Seville. He missed sunlight, noise, freedom. In Madrid he became something else, a shadow in silk, a man who walked among gods but saw only ghosts. And behind it all always was the king. Philip IV commissioned portrait after portrait. He aged on Velázquez's canvas, subtly, truthfully. No one else was allowed to touch his image. No one else dared reveal his weaknesses. But Velázquez did. Gently. Without cruelty. With intimacy. In private, the king would sometimes visit Diego's studio unannounced. They would sit in silence, the only sound the ticking of a dying fire. Once Philip asked, "Do you think I'm a good man?" Diego didn't answer. He never did. But the portrait that followed said everything. Part 3: Blood and Pigment. Beneath the silks and brocade of court life, Diego Velázquez bore a secret obsession. Not with power, not with money, not even with the king. But with truth. And truth in the 17th century was a dangerous thing. In the palace, everyone lied. The queen wore a smile she didn't feel. The priests promised salvation in exchange for silence. The nobles performed piety while bathing in decadence. But Velázquez watched and recorded. Not with words. With color. He once confessed to a friend that painting is a kind of silent justice. But justice demanded sacrifice. To bring life into his canvases, Velázquez did things few ever discovered. While others painted with imported pigments, he experimented, grinding minerals with wine oil, sometimes even blood. Not human. Or so he said. But among his private journals, scattered with sketches of half-formed faces and spine-like brushstrokes, one note stood out, written in a feverish, unsteady hand. The richest red is born of suffering. Ochre alone is not enough. The soul must bleed. Was it metaphor? Madness? Or memory? There were rumors. A servant disappeared from the Alcazar in the winter of 1635. A mute boy who cleaned brushes and crushed pigments for Diego. They said he ran away. But the palace guards whispered differently, that his scream had been heard once, then never again. And the next painting Velázquez unveiled was the now legendary Mars. A portrait of the god of war, slumped, weary, helmet tilted, eyes hollow. The crimson in the background was not crimson at all, scholars later discovered, but a mixture of iron oxide, vermilion, and something else. Something organic. Untraceable. Velázquez never explained. He was changing. As the court consumed him, his eyes darkened. His brushstrokes grew bolder, angrier. The paintings that once whispered now howled. He painted dwarfs with the dignity of kings. Painted jesters with eyes wiser than their masters. Painted the aging queen with every wrinkle exposed, every sorrow unhidden. The clergy protested. "This is blasphemy," one bishop declared. "You paint the world not as God made it, but as the devil sees it." Diego didn't flinch. "Perhaps God is tired," he said, "and the devil has better eyes." That phrase would follow him for years, printed in secret pamphlets, repeated in taverns, whispered in cathedrals. It nearly cost him his life. But Philip IV intervened. The king had come to depend on Velázquez in ways no one fully grasped. He needed his gaze, his brutal honesty. He needed to see himself, not as the court saw him but as he truly was. In a strange way, Velázquez became the king's confessor. Through him, Philip saw his own decay. His loneliness. His failures. And perhaps, his guilt. But the court was rotting faster than either of them realized. The 30 Years' War bled Spain dry. The colonies were slipping. Famine crept through the countryside. The people starved while the palace danced. And still Diego painted. He painted the surrender of Breda, turning defeat into glory, illusion into fact. He painted Venus, her naked back exposed to a mirror, daring the Inquisition to act. They didn't. Perhaps they feared what he might paint next. But the truth was, Velázquez feared himself. In private his health declined. He grew restless, insomniac, pacing his studio like a prisoner. He began painting with the lights out, trusting his hands, not his eyes. Servants found him murmuring to his canvases at night. Not prayers, not poetry, but strange questions. Do you see me? Or only what I allow you to see? One evening, while working on a portrait of a royal child, he collapsed. His mouth foamed. His hands trembled uncontrollably. The physicians called it melancholia profunda. But Diego knew better. He was losing himself inside the canvas. Each work took more of him. Not metaphorically, literally. He would bleed from his fingernails after long nights. His teeth loosened. His sight blurred. And yet he couldn't stop. Because the truth demanded everything. Part 4, The Mirror and the Mask. Seville's dusty courtyards, where Velázquez once copied shadows with charcoal on sun-bleached walls, were now memories replaced by the chill and gold of Madrid's royal chambers. At 24 he was summoned to court. The invitation came not as a whisper of admiration, but as a command from Count Duke Olivares himself, the king's power broker. Velázquez was chosen to paint the King of Spain, Philip IV. But Velázquez didn't merely paint a king. He painted a man slowly unraveling beneath the weight of an empire in decline. Philip IV was not what Velázquez expected. Regal, yes, but tired. A man wearied by responsibility, whose eyes hid behind the glittering medals and polished buttons. When Velázquez entered the room to paint him, he did not bow immediately. He observed. He searched. He saw the faint twitch in the king's jaw, the melancholy that crept between each breath. Then he set to work. The portrait was unlike any seen before at court. It was restrained yet piercing, elegant but unflattering. It revealed power, yes, but also the solitude behind the throne. When the court gasped, Philip stared long into his own painted eyes. Then he whispered, "Only God and Velázquez know what I truly am." Thus began a peculiar intimacy, not of equals but of observer and subject, a silent pact written in oil and canvas. Velázquez became more than a court painter. He was a shadow that moved through the palace, recording, revealing. He painted dwarfs not as court jesters but as full humans, tired and dignified. He painted the queen not in splendor, but with a hint of loneliness. He painted royal children with eyes that questioned why their smiles were always rehearsed. Madrid adored him, or feared him, because he showed the truth. But truth had a price. One winter evening, a noble woman came to his studio in secret. Her name was Dona Celestina, a widow of noble blood, her face veiled in black. She whispered to him, "Paint me as I am. Not for court. For memory." Velázquez agreed. For weeks she returned, unveiling her story as she unveiled her face, a tale of forbidden love, betrayal, and exile. The portrait that emerged was haunting. A woman cloaked in grief, her eyes burning with secrets. The painting was never shown. It vanished days after she disappeared. Some said the Inquisition took it. Others said the king himself hid it. Velázquez said nothing. But in his private diary, a single line was found, written in his sharp, angular hand. "Some truths are too heavy for the frame." Part 5, The Shadows. By the mid-1640s, Diego Velázquez was no longer merely a painter. He was the mirror of an empire, the one who carried its image on fragile canvas, even as the empire itself began to crumble under the weight of wars, debts, and fading glory. Yet within the gilded halls of Madrid, one man still saw him not only as a court servant, but as a visionary. King Philip IV, older now, hollow-eyed and melancholic, grew more dependent on Diego's presence. "You do not paint me," he once whispered, "you interpret me." And perhaps it was true, for Diego captured more than the features of his patron. He captured the loneliness behind the crown, the heavy silence in the throne room, the slow erosion of power disguised in velvet and ermine. But with this intimacy came burdens. Velázquez was appointed chamberlain of the palace, not an honor but a trap. Now he was responsible for all the king's private chambers, ceremonies, and endless rituals. Brushes gathered dust. Paints dried in their jars. The studio, once alive with spirit, now sat in silence as Diego shuffled from duty to duty, always dressed not as an artist but as a courtier. He hated it. And yet he endured. He sketched in the margins of royal ledgers. He painted from memory in sleepless hours. And when he finally returned to the canvas, something had changed. The lines were deeper, the shadows longer. His hands no longer trembled with the thrill of youth, but they knew truths now they hadn't before. It was in this later period that he painted the portrait of Pope Innocent X, a journey to Rome he undertook again against court resistance. The Pope, a cruel-eyed, calculating man, almost refused to sit for him. But when the painting was done, he is said to have muttered, stunned, "È troppo vero." It is too true. Too true. Because Velázquez no longer painted men, he exposed them. The Pope, a symbol of divine authority, was here rendered as mortal, suspicious, tired, real. A man, not a myth. The church shivered. Back in Spain, Diego grew more silent. He walked slowly through the palace, now a ghost among ghosts. The queen had died. His daughter had married. The king, old and regretful, lingered like a shadow on the edge of the frame. But then, in 1656, Diego created what many believe was his final great scream of genius. Las Meninas. It was a painting of a moment, and all moments. A young princess, Margaret Teresa, stands in the light. Her maids, a dwarf, a dog, a chaperone, all frozen in motion. Behind them, Velázquez paints himself into the scene, brush in hand, staring directly at us. On the far wall, a mirror reflects the king and queen watching. But where are they really standing? Are they posing? Are they looking at the painting? Or are we them? Las Meninas was a labyrinth. A meditation on reality, illusion, identity, and power. It was not just a painting, it was a question. A question still unanswered. In it, Velázquez gave everything, his mastery of space, light, and soul. But there was something else hidden in the composition. A farewell. He had written himself into history, as both witness and participant. A painter who dared to stand among kings. But the light was fading. Part 6, The Silent Room. It was July 1660. A royal wedding had taken Diego, now aged and frail, to the humid fields of northern Spain, where the French and Spanish courts had gathered to seal peace through marriage. The heat was unbearable. The weight of ceremony crushed his lungs. After days of negotiation, hosting, and royal obligations, Diego collapsed. Fever took him. He lay in a chamber in the palace of Buen Retiro, where once he had walked as a younger man, dreaming of paint and glory. Now he stared at the cracked ceiling, his breath shallow, his hands no longer able to hold a brush. His wife Juana came to him. She held his hand, kissed his forehead. She too would die only days later, as if her soul could not bear to live without him. In those final moments, Diego asked for no priest. He asked for no last rites. Only silence. Some say he murmured one name. Not the king. Not the Pope. Infanta. The little girl he had immortalized in Las Meninas. But perhaps it was not her alone. Perhaps she was the last symbol of all he had painted: youth, fragility, light, and the tragic knowledge that nothing lasts forever. Velázquez died on August 6, 1660. He was buried in the church of San Juan Bautista, but the church was later destroyed. No grave remains. His body is lost to time. Only his work remains. But that work sings. It sings with sorrow, with rage, with love, with questions. It sings through the darkness of centuries, calling us back to look again. And perhaps, in a quiet gallery somewhere, you stand before Las Meninas and for a moment, you feel it. The eyes of the painter. Watching you. Not judging. Not pleading. Just watching. As if to ask, what do you see?